The story of the Battle of Szigetvár in 1566 is one of the most extraordinary episodes in European history, a tale of courage, sacrifice, and the clash of empires at the height of the Ottoman expansion. When the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent advanced into Hungary, they encountered fierce resistance from a small but determined garrison led by Nikola Šubić Zrinski, a Croatian nobleman and commander. Only 2,300 men stood against a massive Ottoman army numbering nearly 100,000. The siege that followed became legendary, not only because of the dramatic imbalance of numbers but also because of the unyielding defiance of the defenders who fought until the very end, cementing their place in history as symbols of valor and sacrifice. At the time, the Ottoman Empire was one of the most powerful forces in the world, stretching from North Africa to the Middle East and deep into Europe. Suleiman had already gained a reputation as a conqueror, having captured Belgrade, Rhodes, and much of Hungary. By 1566, his eyes were fixed on Vienna once again, seeking to extend Ottoman influence deeper into Central Europe. Szigetvár, a small fortress town in southern Hungary, lay directly in his path. Though strategically modest, it was a stubborn obstacle that Suleiman could not bypass without risking a vulnerable supply line. It was here that destiny brought together one of the largest armies of the Ottoman Empire and a tiny but fearless garrison that refused to surrender. Nikola Zrinski was well aware that his force was heavily outnumbered and that relief from Habsburg forces was unlikely. Still, he prepared his men for a defense that would become legendary. The fortress of Szigetvár was composed of three sections: the Old Town, the New Town, and the castle itself, each connected by drawbridges and surrounded by marshes that made direct assaults difficult. Zrinski used every advantage the terrain and fortifications provided, understanding that their only hope was to delay the Ottoman advance as long as possible. His men knew the odds, but under their leader's inspiration, they resolved to fight to the last. The Ottoman army, led personally by Suleiman and his Grand Vizier Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, was immense. Contemporary accounts suggest that the Ottomans may have had over 90,000 soldiers, including elite janissaries, artillery units, cavalry, and engineers skilled in siege warfare. They also brought with them one of the largest siege train arsenals of the period, determined to crush Szigetvár quickly before continuing their advance toward Vienna. Despite their overwhelming strength, what they encountered at Szigetvár was far beyond what they had expected. The small garrison fought with relentless ferocity, repelling assault after assault, raining down gunfire, arrows, and boiling oil on the attackers, and launching daring sorties to sabotage Ottoman siege works. The siege began in early August 1566, and from the very start, the defenders demonstrated their resolve. Whenever the Ottomans launched a major assault, they were met with walls of musket fire and fierce close combat resistance. The marshes surrounding the fortress made it difficult for Ottoman artillery to be positioned effectively, forcing them to build causeways and trenches under constant harassment from the defenders. Zrinski himself was often seen on the walls, inspiring his men, fighting side by side with them, and reminding them that their sacrifice was not just for Szigetvár but for Christendom itself. The defenders knew that by holding out, they were buying valuable time for the Habsburg forces to strengthen their positions further west. As the siege dragged on, conditions within the fortress grew desperate. Food supplies dwindled, fresh water became scarce, and disease began to spread among the defenders. Still, the morale of the garrison did not falter. Zrinski gave fiery speeches, urging his men to embrace death with honor rather than live with shame under Ottoman domination. The defenders, wives and families, who were inside the fortress, also contributed to the defense, carrying water, preparing weapons, and in some cases even taking part in combat. It was truly a collective stand where every man, woman, and child understood the stakes. Meanwhile, the Ottoman army was also facing difficulties. The marshy terrain and strong resistance slowed their progress, and the summer heat took its toll. Sultan Suleiman, by this time an old man in his 70s, was gravely ill during the campaign. While he remained in his tent directing the siege, his health declined steadily, and he eventually died on September 6, 1566, before the final assault on Szigetvár. His death was initially kept secret by the Ottoman commanders to avoid a collapse in morale, but it cast a shadow over the campaign. What was intended to be a triumphant march toward Vienna had turned into a grueling and costly siege. After nearly a month of relentless fighting, the Ottomans finally breached the outer defenses and captured the Old Town and New Town, leaving only the castle itself. Zrinski and his surviving warriors retreated into the final stronghold, knowing that their end was near. Rather than surrender, they prepared for one last, glorious stand. On September 7, Zrinski gathered his remaining men, numbering perhaps a few hundred, and led a final charge out of the castle gates against the massed Ottoman forces. With sabers and muskets in hand, they fought with astonishing fury, cutting down many enemies before being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Zrinski himself fell in battle, but not before inflicting heavy casualties. As the Ottomans finally swarmed into the castle, the defenders had prepared one last surprise. The gunpowder magazine was ignited, creating a massive explosion that killed thousands of Ottoman soldiers along with the last defenders of Szigetvár. The fall of Szigetvár was inevitable given the disparity of numbers, but its impact was far greater than anyone could have anticipated. The Ottomans lost tens of thousands of men during the siege, including many of their elite troops. The death of Suleiman during the campaign marked the end of an era, as he was the last great sultan of the Ottoman Golden Age. His successors would never match his power or prestige, and the failure to reach Vienna in 1566 meant that the frontier of Ottoman expansion into Central Europe remained contested. The defenders of Szigetvár, though annihilated, became immortalized in European memory as heroes who stood against impossible odds. The legacy of Nikola Zrinski and his warriors is celebrated to this day in Hungary and Croatia, where they are seen as symbols of national pride and resistance. The siege entered folklore, literature, and even opera, inspiring countless retellings of their bravery. In many ways, the stand at Szigetvár became a defining moment in the long struggle between the Ottoman Empire and Europe, illustrating how the courage of a few could influence the course of history. The delay they caused to the Ottoman advance bought precious time for Vienna and the Habsburgs, ensuring that Central Europe would not fall easily to Ottoman rule. When reflecting on the numbers, it seems almost unimaginable that 2,300 defenders could hold out so long against nearly 100,000 attackers. Yet, the courage, determination, and tactical ingenuity of Zrinski and his men made it possible. Their use of the fortress's defenses, their refusal to surrender despite hunger and disease, and their willingness to fight to the last man turned what could have been a quick Ottoman victory into a month-long ordeal. In military history, the siege of Szigetvár stands alongside Thermopylae and Masada as one of the greatest examples of defiance against overwhelming odds. The Battle of Szigetvár was not just a military confrontation, it was a clash of civilizations, ideologies, and destinies. The Ottomans sought to extend their dominion further into Europe, while the defenders fought not just for their homes but for the preservation of their way of life. The story captures the essence of human resilience, showing how even in the face of certain death, people can find meaning in sacrifice and leave behind a legacy that echoes through the centuries. It reminds us that history is not always written by the victors, sometimes it is the courage of the fallen that shapes the future. Today, visiting the site of Szigetvár, one can still feel the echoes of that epic siege. Monuments and memorials honor the memory of Zrinski and his warriors, while the story continues to inspire historians, writers, and ordinary people alike. It is a testament to the enduring power of courage, the willingness to stand firm even when defeat is inevitable, and the belief that some causes are worth dying for. The defenders of Szigetvár knew they could not win, but by holding the line, they ensured that their sacrifice would live forever in the annals of history. Theirs was a death that became immortal, a battle that turned into legend, and a moment when 2,300 warriors defied 100,000 soldiers and changed the course of Europe's destiny. Background of the Ottoman expansion. By the mid-16th century, the Ottoman Empire was at its zenith, ruled by one of its greatest leaders, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. The empire stretched from the Middle East across North Africa and deep into southeastern Europe. Suleiman had already captured Belgrade in 1521 and much of Hungary by 1526 after the Battle of Mohacs, where King Louis II of Hungary was killed. His campaigns brought the Ottomans to the gates of Vienna in 1529, but their failure to capture the city left the empire hungry for another attempt at domination in Central Europe. By 1566, Suleiman was elderly but determined to leave one final mark in history. Vienna was again his ultimate target, but standing in his way was the fortress of Szigetvár in southern Hungary. Though small in size, its position controlled key routes into Austria. The Ottomans saw it as an obstacle that must be eliminated to secure supply lines before a push toward Vienna. Thus, Szigetvár became the stage where one of Europe's most dramatic sieges would unfold, setting 2,300 defenders against an Ottoman force that some chroniclers claimed numbered close to 100,000. Strategic importance of Szigetvár. At first glance, Szigetvár might not appear as significant as great cities like Buda or Vienna. However, its geographic position made it a vital fortress in the network of defenses along the Habsburg-Ottoman frontier. Built on marshland surrounded by swamps and rivers, the fortress was naturally difficult to assault. Its location acted as a bottleneck, controlling access routes deeper into Habsburg territory. For the Ottomans, leaving such a stronghold in enemy hands meant risking constant attacks on their rear supply lines during their campaign toward Vienna. For the Habsburgs and their Croatian allies, Szigetvár was a forward defense line that could delay or even halt the Ottoman advance. Strategically, the defenders of Szigetvár understood that their stand would not just protect their own lands but buy precious time for Habsburg reinforcements further west. In this sense, the siege of Szigetvár became far more than just a local battle, it was a struggle for the control of Central Europe. The Ottomans, confident in their overwhelming numbers and firepower, expected the fortress to fall quickly. Yet what awaited them was a defense so fierce and unrelenting that it would shake their campaign to its core and change the course of European history. Nikola Šubić Zrinski. At the heart of the defense stood Nikola Šubić Zrinski, a Croatian nobleman and seasoned military commander. Born into the powerful Zrinski family, he had grown up in an era when Croatian nobles were constantly fighting Ottoman incursions along the frontier. His reputation as a fearless warrior was already established by the time of the siege, as he had led numerous successful campaigns against Ottoman raiders. In 1566, as commander of Szigetvár, Zrinski found himself facing the challenge of his lifetime. Leading a garrison of just 2,300 men, he knew the odds were impossibly against him, yet he resolved to fight to the last. Zrinski was not only a military leader but also a charismatic figure who inspired loyalty through his personal bravery. He often fought alongside his men on the ramparts, refusing to hide in safety while others risked their lives. To him, the defense of Szigetvár was both a matter of honor and faith. He viewed the struggle as not merely defending a fortress but standing as a bulwark of Christendom against Ottoman expansion. His leadership and unwavering spirit transformed a small garrison into a symbol of defiance whose courage would echo through the centuries. The Ottoman army, facing Zrinski and his men, was one of the mightiest armies ever assembled by the Ottomans. Led personally by Sultan Suleiman, though aged and ailing, the force reportedly numbered close to 100,000 soldiers. This included the elite janissaries, the backbone of the Ottoman infantry, trained from childhood to be loyal to the Sultan. Alongside them were the Sipahi cavalry, artillery units with massive cannons, and engineers skilled in building trenches, bridges, and siege works. The Ottoman military machine was well organized, experienced in countless sieges, and supplied by a vast logistical network. Their confidence was bolstered by their numerical superiority, which dwarfed the garrison of Szigetvár. They expected a swift victory, seeing the small fortress as little more than a warm-up before striking at Vienna. Yet, despite their strength, the siege would prove unexpectedly grueling. The marshy terrain hindered the movement of heavy cannons, the defenders' counterattacks constantly disrupted siege works, and the fierce resistance of Zrinski's warriors inflicted devastating casualties. For the Ottoman soldiers, what should have been an easy conquest turned into a nightmare of attrition. Even with overwhelming manpower and artillery, the Ottoman army would learn that determination and courage could defy even the greatest empire. Fortifications of Szigetvár. The fortress of Szigetvár was small compared to great medieval citadels, but its design and natural defenses made it formidable. Built on marshland, it consisted of three main sections: the Old Town, the New Town, and the Central Castle, each connected by bridges and protected by moats. The marshes surrounding the fortress acted as natural barriers, making direct assaults difficult. Any attacking army had to construct causeways and bridges under constant fire from the defenders. The fortress walls were reinforced with earthworks, which absorbed the impact of cannon fire better than stone. Inside, the narrow streets and compact layout allowed defenders to retreat from one section to the next, prolonging the fight. Nikola Zrinski understood the strengths of the fortifications and used them to maximum advantage, organizing layered defenses that forced the Ottomans to fight for every inch of ground. The design meant that even after the old and new towns were captured, the defenders could retreat into the castle for a final stand. This system of defenses turned Szigetvár into a fortress far stronger than its size suggested, one that would require immense sacrifice from the Ottomans to capture. The beginning of the siege, August 1566. The siege began in early August when the Ottoman army surrounded Szigetvár and began positioning their artillery. From the first days, it was clear that the defenders would not yield easily. The Ottomans launched heavy bombardments, attempting to break down the walls, but the marshy ground made it difficult to place their cannons effectively. Zrinski's men responded with musket fire and daring sorties, often sneaking out at night to destroy Ottoman siege works. The defenders' resilience surprised the Ottoman commanders, who had anticipated a rapid collapse. For the soldiers inside the fortress, the first weeks were filled with constant fighting, day and night. Cannonballs smashed into the walls, arrows and bullets filled the air, and fires broke out frequently, only to be extinguished by desperate defenders. Despite the pressure, morale remained high, as Zrinski encouraged his men with speeches and his visible presence on the front lines. The Ottomans, frustrated by the slow progress, intensified their efforts, bringing in more artillery and digging trenches closer to the walls. Yet every gain came at a heavy cost, as the defenders fought with ferocity that seemed to multiply their numbers many times over. Heroic defense tactics. Throughout the siege, the defenders employed creative and courageous tactics to offset their numerical disadvantage. Musketeers rained fire from the walls, targeting Ottoman engineers and officers to disrupt command. Boiling water, tar, and even flaming projectiles were hurled onto attackers who attempted to storm the defenses. When Ottoman miners tried to tunnel under the walls, the defenders dug counter mines, engaging in deadly underground combat. Zrinski also organized surprise sorties, where small groups of defenders would rush out, burn siege engines, or cut down enemy soldiers before retreating back inside. These attacks, though costly, delayed Ottoman progress and inflicted psychological damage. Women and civilians contributed by carrying ammunition, pouring boiling oil, and even joining in the defense when needed. The garrison's determination was matched only by their ingenuity, making the fortress seem far stronger than its actual size. Ottoman chroniclers later wrote with astonishment at the courage of the defenders, noting that they fought with the desperation of men who had already accepted death. The defenders knew that surrender was not an option, their only chance for honor and meaning lay in resisting to the last, and so they transformed the fortress into a bastion of heroic defiance. Life inside the fortress. As the siege dragged on, life inside Szigetvár grew increasingly difficult. Supplies of food and water began to dwindle, forcing rationing. Fresh water was scarce, as the Ottomans cut off access to nearby wells and streams. Disease spread quickly in the cramped and unsanitary conditions. Despite this, morale remained astonishingly high. Nikola Zrinski constantly reminded his men of the importance of their sacrifice, framing their struggle as a defense not only of their land but of all of Christendom. Families inside the fortress played a vital role. Wives and children carried water, prepared food, tended to the wounded, and even helped reload muskets during the heaviest assaults. The sounds of battle were constant, day and night, leaving little rest for anyone. Hunger gnawed at the defenders, but the spirit of resistance never broke. Many wrote letters or left behind testaments, knowing they were unlikely to survive. Their courage was born of the understanding that they were part of something greater than themselves, that their deaths would not be in vain. Within those walls, a community was forged by shared suffering and unshakable resolve, turning Szigetvár into more than just a fortress. It became a symbol of unity in the face of doom. Ottoman struggles. For the Ottomans, the siege turned into a nightmare that dragged on far longer than expected. The marshy terrain made it difficult to transport and position heavy artillery, forcing engineers to build elaborate wooden platforms and causeways under constant enemy fire. The summer heat took its toll, with disease and exhaustion spreading through the camp. The defenders' sorties constantly sabotaged siege works, destroying bridges, burning trenches, and killing engineers. Casualties mounted, with thousands of Ottoman soldiers falling in repeated assaults that gained little ground. Morale began to suffer, as what was supposed to be an easy victory became a bloody grind. Even the elite janissaries faced heavy losses, something that shocked Ottoman commanders. Adding to the difficulties was the advanced age and failing health of Sultan Suleiman, who was unable to personally inspire his men as in earlier campaigns. The longer the siege lasted, the more resources and lives were drained, raising questions about whether Szigetvár was worth the cost. Yet the Ottomans could not withdraw without victory, their honor and reputation demanded the fortress's fall. Thus, the siege became a test of endurance, with both sides locked in a brutal struggle that consumed thousands of lives. The death of Suleiman the Magnificent. During the siege, Sultan Suleiman, the once mighty conqueror, was in his 70s and in declining health. Though present with the army, he was confined to his tent much of the time. His commanders managed the day-to-day conduct of the siege while trying to maintain the illusion that their sultan still directed operations. On September 6, 1566, Suleiman died quietly in his tent, marking the end of an era for the Ottoman Empire. His death was kept secret by his Grand Vizier, Sokolu Mehmed Pasha, who feared that revealing the news would demoralize the army and cause chaos during a critical stage of the siege. Only a few trusted officials knew the truth, while Suleiman's death was concealed until after the fortress fell. The Sultan's passing during the campaign cast a symbolic shadow over the entire operation. The empire's greatest ruler, who had expanded its borders to their furthest extent, did not live to see the final victory at Szigetvár. His death marked the beginning of a gradual decline in Ottoman power, for none of his successors would match his vision or achievements. Thus, the siege of Szigetvár became not only the defenders' last stand but also Suleiman's final campaign. Fall of the outer towns. After weeks of brutal combat, the Ottomans finally managed to breach the outer defenses of Szigetvár. First the old town, then the new town fell under relentless bombardment and assaults. The defenders fought fiercely for every street and building, retreating only when resistance became impossible. Fires consumed much of the outer sections, adding to the devastation. By this time, the defenders had suffered heavy casualties, and exhaustion was visible on every face. Yet they did not surrender. Instead, Zrinski and his remaining warriors withdrew into the innermost castle, determined to make a final stand. The fall of the outer towns was a heavy blow, but it also meant that the Ottomans had to pay dearly for every inch gained. Casualties among the attackers continued to climb, as each layer of defense required fresh assaults. The Ottomans believed that the castle would soon crumble as well, but they underestimated the defenders' resolve. Within the castle walls, Zrinski and his men prepared themselves for their last days, knowing full well that their fate was sealed but also that their defiance had already left an indelible mark on history. Nikola Zrinski's last stand. By early September, with only a few hundred warriors left, Nikola Zrinski knew that the end was inevitable. Yet rather than wait passively for death, he chose to go out in a blaze of glory. On September 7, Zrinski dressed in his finest armor and gave a rousing speech to his men, urging them to embrace death with honor and to take as many enemies with them as possible. With his remaining soldiers, he threw open the gates of the castle and charged straight into the massed ranks of the Ottoman army. The sudden ferocity of the sortie caught the Ottomans off guard. The defenders fought with unmatched fury, cutting down enemies with swords, muskets, and axes. Zrinski himself fought at the front, slaying many before being struck down by enemy fire. His men continued the assault until they were surrounded and overwhelmed. The charge was suicidal, but it embodied the spirit of defiance that had defined the entire siege. In that final stand, the defenders of Szigetvár chose death on their own terms, turning their inevitable defeat into an immortal act of heroism. The explosion of the fortress. As the last defenders fell, the Ottomans surged into the castle, expecting to finally claim victory. But the defenders had prepared one last, devastating surprise. Hidden within the castle was a massive store of gunpowder. As the Ottomans entered, the remaining defenders ignited the powder magazine, unleashing a colossal explosion. The blast tore through the castle, killing thousands of Ottoman soldiers in an instant. Flames and smoke rose into the sky, and the sound of the detonation echoed for miles. The explosion was both a final act of defiance and a symbolic statement. Though defeated, the defenders would ensure that their enemies paid dearly for every drop of blood spilled. For the Ottomans, victory came at a staggering cost. What should have been a simple conquest had turned into one of the bloodiest sieges in their history. For the defenders, the explosion was a final declaration that surrender had never been an option. It turned their destruction into a legend, ensuring that the fall of Szigetvár would never be remembered as a mere defeat but as a story of sacrifice and defiance that transcended death itself. Consequences of the siege. The immediate consequence of the siege was a costly Ottoman victory that came at an unexpectedly high price. Tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers perished, including many janissaries and experienced officers. The fortress was reduced to rubble, and its defenders annihilated, but the Ottomans were left weakened and demoralized. More importantly, the death of Sultan Suleiman during the campaign meant that the empire lost its greatest leader at a critical moment. His successor, Selim II, lacked his father's military vision and ambition, shifting Ottoman focus away from Central Europe. The siege of Szigetvár thus prevented a renewed advance on Vienna, sparing the Habsburg capital from another great Ottoman assault. In the broader picture, Szigetvár marked the turning point where Ottoman expansion into Central Europe slowed significantly. For the Habsburgs, the defenders, sacrifice became a rallying cry, strengthening resistance against future invasions. The legend of Szigetvár inspired generations, proving that even overwhelming power could be checked by determination and courage. Though the Ottomans technically won the siege, the true victory belonged to the memory of those who fought and died. Defending the fortress. Legacy of Szigetvár. The legacy of the Battle of Szigetvár endures centuries later as a symbol of ultimate courage against impossible odds. In Hungary and Croatia, Nikola Zrinski is celebrated as a national hero, and the siege is remembered as one of the defining moments of resistance against Ottoman expansion. Poems, songs, and even operas have been written about the battle, immortalizing the defenders in cultural memory. Historians often compare Szigetvár to other legendary last stands, such as Thermopylae, Masada, or the Alamo, where small forces fought bravely against overwhelming enemies. For Europeans of the time, the story of Szigetvár provided inspiration and reassurance that the Ottoman advance was not unstoppable. Even the Ottomans themselves reportedly admired the courage of the defenders, recognizing the extraordinary bravery displayed during the siege. Today, monuments and memorials at Szigetvár honor the fallen, and their story continues to be retold as an example of sacrifice, unity, and defiance. The siege stands as a reminder that history is not always shaped by numbers or power, but often by the courage of those willing to fight against overwhelming odds. The 2,300 warriors of Szigetvár proved that even in defeat, honor and heroism can achieve immortality.